Fridland. And first, I want to say thank you for joining us today. I hopefully, like you, got out of my pajamas for this event, and I'm always excited when I have that opportunity these days. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about sociolinguistics because you may never have heard of that. It's not exactly the most common field. We're definitely not as common as lawyers and doctors. Probably not as useful either, but I'll let you decide after this talk is over. So in sociolinguistics, we're interested in looking at how language structure on one hand interacts and engages with, hold on, I'm gonna change my view for just a second, interacts and engages with social structure. Now, I think a lot of us think about language in this way. So we think about different terms, for example, that how that identifies them somehow. So we, think about terms like Google or tweet. Now, those certainly represent some sort of societal or cultural moment, movement. Certainly social distancing, pandemic mean very important things culturally. So we can definitely think about language in large scale like that in terms of how, but I think more importantly, what we want to talk about are very fine level distinctions that are probably cumulatively more important to language variation and change over time, to representing our social identities and ourselves, than those large level things like words, which are actually quite superficial if you think about them in terms of differences among us, because I can teach you a word. How long did it take us all to learn social distancing? Well, some of us are having maybe harder times than others, but in terms of actually learning the term, we're all pretty familiar with it now. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we became more similar socially, right? It might mean we're experiencing something similar socially, but it doesn't mean my social identity has fundamentally changed in any way and is represented by using that term. So what we really want to talk about when we talk about language differences as a sociolinguist are the ones that are a lot more important to the trajectory of our language over time. And so I look at very subtle little parts of language. So for example, the types of vowels that you might use, or what your past participial ending looks like. Now that might seem pretty boring and obvious, but we vary a lot in the way that we do that, and it's quite meaningful. So think if I say I'm talking versus I'm talking. Both of those say the same thing in terms of the semantic content, but they mean very different things about, for example, our relationship. I'm probably going to say I'm talking to you instead of I'm talking to you in different contexts. It also, it has been shown, means something about our gender. So women, for example, are much more likely to use ing than in than men. There's lots of different variations, and we could go into that morphological ending forever. But in general, what we want to look at are small level details like that. My specialty in terms of my research are vowel movements. Now, don't worry, I'm not a gastroenterologist. You haven't switched screens. I'm actually talking about vowel movements with a V. And what is that? Because that seems like a weird subject, perhaps, to spend your lifetime studying. Well, actually, it's not. Almost all of you would say, okay, I've really experienced some weird vowels in my life. And maybe you use them, but certainly you've noticed them with other people. I know we probably have a lot of people in New York watching this, and certainly New York vowels are in particular very distinct. So think about when you go and you ask for something to put your groceries in New York. It's not a bag, it's a bag, right? Or if I'm Southern, which luckily I am, if I am saying something to say goodbye to you, I might say bye-bye, bye-bye. And again, that's something significant socially about your vowels. But vowels are not just regionally distinct. They're actually distinct by very many social qualities we might possess. So for example, if I'm black or white, if I'm young or old, if I'm male or female, all of those things have very significant consequences for how you say your vowels. So those are the types of things I'm interested in. Not only because they're pretty fascinating just to learn about ourselves and how they develop that way, but also because we have found in our research that the way you pronounce your vowels and the way people around you pronounce them can actually affect the way that you process speech. So your cognitive system is interlocked with your social system in that way. So that is really what a sociolinguist studies, those really kind of deep level language structure, social structure types of relationships. But I'm not going to make you study vowels all day today, much as I'd love to, and I could talk for hours on that. It tends to put people to sleep. So since hopefully you're not in your pajamas, we will try to avoid that. I thought I'd talk to you today about other aspects of dialects. So, when we talk about dialects,
I have a question before you move on.
Sure.
Someone would like to ask you, is that a micro application? in the Sapir-Whorf theorem?
Uh-oh, someone's reading their linguistic anthropology. Well, you know, Sapir-Whorf is certainly a language in mind concept that deals with language being locked down by the social system and the social system being locked down by language. So basically language is a prison. Well, there are certainly some relationships between what I study in sociolinguistics and what one studies if they're a proponent of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And for anybody that doesn't know what that is, it's the idea brought forth by linguistic anthropologists in the 1940s and 50s that became very popular, that said that whatever structure your language has basically traps the way you view your world by that language structure. So for example, if my language doesn't have a word for future tense or past tense, that it actually might change the way that I perceive of the world as being continuous rather than having these distinct separations between something that happened in the past and something that happened in the future. And certainly if you think about it, we do tend to think about things that way. But sociolinguistics is actually a little different than that, although I think we would agree that social structure and language structure are inherently tied. I saw someone with their hand
Yeah, we
up.
have a hand raised from Bryce Gitson. If you'd like to unmute yourself to ask the question, otherwise I'll go ahead and put it out there, what you have in the chat.
Oh, no, I was just clarifying the Sapir-Whorf thing, but also that comes to mind immediately. There's this, I think it's Tom Scott video on YouTube that talks about how, like, I think it's in Russian, they have like a specific word for the intersection of green and blue, so that like Russian people can actually see shades of blue and green more clearly than other cultures who don't have that distinction.
Right. Well, certainly with Sapir-Whorf, a lot has been studied with color terminology, and it's true that in Russian, what we think of as blue, so Americans or English speakers would categorize those two colors you're talking about as both blue. It would normally be lighter blue, darker blue. We would describe it as a shade of blue. In Russian, actually, you would describe it as two separate colors. And we found similar things with Chinese. So in Chinese, for example, you know, tan and would be our equivalent of pink. So we have differences in the way we cut up the color spectrum, and there's a ton of examples like that. But that's really more properly a language and mind subject than a sociolinguistic one, although there are certainly overlays. And maybe as we get towards the end of the lecture, we can talk a little bit about how some of the perceptual research that we do does support a little bit of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Bryce, does that answer your question? Okay. Great. All right, well, let's get to dialects because I think they're really interesting and something that we all think about. So just take a second to think about dialects in terms of what you would characterize as one. If you had to name a stereotypical dialect, you know, get an image in your mind of who that would be, who that speaker would be. Now, for many of us, it would be someone like the Clampetts, right? So you think Beverly Hillbillies or maybe Crocodile Dundee or, you know, something New Yorker. So we have all these images of what represents dialects to us. But the reality is actually we all speak a dialect. We're just not all speaking a salient dialect, but we all have things about our speech that make us unique. And these are very low level things that we might not be able to name, but we seem to be able to recognize. And we recognize them not only in ourselves because we choose to do them because of the social identity they project, but also in the other people that we interact with. And it's actually this social interaction that seems most important in forging the dialects that we use over time. So it's really a case of, you know, I do it because you do it, and then we're all cool because we do it together. But I think it's really important to step away and think, well, what am I doing and why am I doing it? And we don't tend to think of dialects that way. So I thought today we'd break down a little bit what dialects are, why we have them, how language changes over time so that we get dialects, because obviously think about British or Australian or American English, all of them started with fundamentally the same basic language and have evolved over time. And so why does that happen? Because it would seem like, okay, I can get that maybe if you don't talk to each other, we might have different words for things, but why do we fundamentally change the system so we're not speaking German today? If we hadn't changed much, we certainly would be. But we don't even sound like our Australian brothers and sisters either. So how does that happen? So I think it's important to think about language as a system before we think about language in the social system. and if we want to understand dialects that way. So why would language variation be important to study, and why does it happen anyway? I think these are key questions that I think about whenever I approach a research topic, and I think we tend not to think about them when we talk about differences in language just at a casual folk linguistic level. So we often have fun with dialect differences, but we don't think about why they're important. So let's kind of start with the big question of why is language change important at all? Well, language as a system is inherently variable. What that means is there is something about the way that our cognitive and physiological architecture is constructed that encourages languages to change in certain ways and not others. This is why language change is so fascinating to study, because it's very patterned and systematic. But the interesting thing about that is it's not predictable. And so when you get patterned and systematic, but unpredictable together, that makes it really exciting to study. So why would language be systematic and patterned in terms of the way that language change happens? Well, because we all have the same mouth and the same brains within reasonable constraints, right? So over time, we have pressures that are called internal pressures. And this would be forms like co-articulatory pressures. So when I say sounds in a word together, the sounds that I say before that one sound and the sound that I say after that one sound will actually start blending together. But they're not random or chaotic in how they blend together. They're actually predictable in the influence they're going to have on each other. Let me give you a really easy example of this, but you're going to have to give me some audience participation. And since I can't hear you, I'm just going to have to put you on the honor system. All right. So everybody say the word key.
Key.
Key. Okay. Now, how about coop?
Coop.
And cup.
Cup.
All right, now say them together, key, coop, cup.
Key, coop, cup.
All right, and then you want to start saying them as if you're going to say the whole word, but pretty much stop with the K sound. So it'd be like key, coo, ka, key, coo, ka. Everybody just do that to themselves. Key, coo, ka. Now, what's interesting is all of those words start with a K sound. Now, that doesn't mean they're spelled with a K sound, because spelling is completely messed up in English, right? So we don't really have a C sound. There's no such thing. In the International Phonetic Alphabet, all things written with C are typically K sounds. So ki, ku, ka. Those are all K sounds, but do they sound the same? They don't, right? And if you—
Some of them are aspirated.
I'm sorry?
Some of them are aspirated. Well, actually, key, yeah, only key.
No, all of them should be aspirated by rules of English. But actually, that's not what just think about your lips. Ki, ku, ka. If you can see my lips, you can see it's different. Ki, ku, ka, right? What's happening is co-articulatory effects. The K in key is before what we call a front vowel, right? Which involves a different lip positioning than back vowels like oo. So ki, ku. When you do a front vowel, your lips are spread. When you do a back vowel, your lips are round. And so what happens is you start spreading the lips too early, and it affects the way you pronounce that K. For coop, you start rounding the lips too early, and it affects the way you say that K. So the K in key is actually phonetically different, not the same as the K in coop. The only reason you think it is because you have a vivid imagination. And that's what we call phonemes. Phonemes are your vivid imagination of the sounds you think you're saying, but you're actually not saying them that way. So if you phonetically measured your K in the key word and your K in coop and the K in cup, they're actually all different. And in some languages would be different enough to be different sounds. But English speakers don't hear them as different sounds. We all hear them as K. So this is inherent variability. This is the range of sounds that your language, just on its own, without any social facts, varies, right? So we make these different sounds because of what come before or after it. In addition, we also have different sizes of our vocal tract and our vocal folds and our nasal passages, and all these things will influence the types of sounds that come out. So for example, if I'm a child, I'm going to have a much smaller physiological tract than an adult. So you can all tell that children sound different than adults. If you hear a child's voice, you generally can recognize it as such. So all of these are sort of parts of our natural architecture that give rise to differences. We also have cognitive differences in terms of how we process sound. our cognitive preferences. Certain sounds are more common among world languages. In fact, pretty much every language in the world has them. And that sounds like T or K or N. Other sounds like velar clicks, right? Not found in English, or interdental sounds like th, which are found in English, but not in many other languages, which is why, you know, when you speaker, you have to say 1, 2, twee instead of 1, 2, 3. Those are all cognitively dispreferred sounds, we think. They don't tend to occur frequently in languages. If you follow the course of language change over time, languages that once had them tend to lose them. So that suggests that we have some inherent preference for certain sounds over the others. And if we look at language change trajectory, we almost always find language change moves in that direction. So here we have what we call internal pressures towards dialects. So inherent variability built in as part of the system itself. The way the mouth is made, the way the vocal tract is sized, and the way that our cognition operates. So just if we did nothing, language would change. If we didn't talk to people, if we had no friends, which would be sad, and it's sort of what we're doing right now, I think, then language would change just with those internal pressures alone. But then you throw in society, and that's where you really get this incredible hot mess of language variation. What's even more interesting when you introduce society is that it helps us figure out why some changes happen at some times in places, but not others. Because if you all have the same cognitive architecture and you all have the same mouth, right? You all have the same basic apparatus for making sounds, then we would predict that we should all move in the direction of most natural changes, right? We would expect that if we were all isolated but speaking, we should undergo these changes at roughly the same rate in the same direction over time. But look at all the languages we speak. That has not happened. And in fact, what we find is the opposite is true, that when you separate speakers with the same language, they change, and they change in ways unlike each other. And this is where we cannot appeal to cognition or physiology to explain why this happens. And this is something called the actuation problem, if you want a big linguistic word, which is, why do some changes happen here and happen now, but not happen then or there? And it's a really important question because we tend to have a lot of different consequences that speakers face when they do different things linguistically. And also, just looking at the evolution of language over time, we want to understand why it is that we change in some ways and not others. So this is a long answer probably to the short question of why it's important to study language variation and why society is a really important part of that to study. Now, before I go into different kinds of pressures from society on language, which is where we get to the really fun stuff, are there any questions that anybody has? All right, looks like everybody's good. Okay, so let's start talking about what are the major players in the game of language change if we're looking at dialects. So think about dialects. Someone give me an example, and you can wave your hand or just unmute yourself. When we are thinking about dialects, what are the most common differences in dialects that we think about? If you wanted to describe a dialect difference, what would it be?
The vowel sounds are usually different.
Okay, and can you tell me vowel sounds in what way? Like, give me an example.
So like I know that like the Western dialect, all of the like open O sounds like in caught, like we
Right.
don't have that anymore.
Right, right, absolutely. And we'll talk about that's called the low back vowel merger, if you want the fancy name for it. So, right, I think that was Heather, right? Heather brought up regional differences. So it's interesting she brought up a Western difference because often when we think about regional differences, it's not really the West that we characterize as having a strongly regional accent.
Yeah.
In fact, it's the North and the South, right, that we tend to think of as being strongly different. So regional differences are certainly one of the key differences that we think about, and probably the most prominent ones when we learn about dialects are differences in region. Now, Heather, I think it was that said that, was actually very astute because she brought up a difference that's at the level of phonology or the sound system. But mostly when we think about regional differences in language, we think about terminology. So for example, if you say soda or pop or Coke. Now, being Southern, I'm in the Coke camp, but I'm going to accept some of you to be in the soda and pop camp, but I might mute you. But, you know, and if you think about those types of differences like frying pan or skillet, green bean or pole bean, Coke, soda or pop, bubbler or water fountain, 101 or the 101, all of these are examples of regional differences, but they're not really all that meaningful because I can certainly start saying soda or pop. I don't have to say Coke. And in fact, I don't go to restaurants and order a Coke anymore, even though that's how I started in my humble beginnings. So those are pretty superficial types of dialect differences, but there are some really important regional dialect differences that have emerged, and Heather gave a really good example of them, and they're at the level of phonology. Mostly we don't recognize these as systemic, really important changes, but we all do them, and they're really more important than vocabulary differences because they show that we're not converging like many people think we are in the face of mass social media and TV and those kinds of communication systems that have opened up in the last 20, 30, 40 years that would suggest that we should be becoming more similar, but we really aren't. So let's talk a little bit about the types of dialects that we find regionally now, because most of us are not even aware. Now, I'm impressed that Heather knew about the low-back vowel merger because that's something that people tend to do and not know they do it. But let's start with the North and the South because we tend to think of those as regionally distinct. And I think we even still think of them as somewhat regionally distinct today, although we do have evidence that the differences between them are somewhat leveling. And by leveling, I mean they're becoming less noticeable over time. Now, part of that is because of something we call linguistic swamping, which sounds really kind of unpleasant, but it actually simply means when we start moving into each other's dialect areas, we tend to talk more like each other if we start hanging out together more. And in a lot of the urban South, this has indeed happened as it's become more industrial over time and less agriculturally based. We have a lot of large companies moving there, and with large companies come large amounts of people. And those large amount of people tend not to just come from the South. So as more and more Southerners have been in common interaction with non-Southerners, they have become less likely to use shibboleths of Southern speech or really sort of identifiable Southern sounds from what they used to say. Now, things like this would be the pin-pen merger, which most people have heard about, which is where, you know, you want to write with a pen and stick yourself with a pen. Probably neither of those sounds attractive, but where they sound the same. If you look at young speakers in the South, especially in urban areas, you find that those differences are no longer there. You can also look at I monophthization as a really good indicator of leveling. So I monophthization is the example I gave earlier, bye-bye now, or Todd, I'm tied up right now instead of tied. That actually is a very difficult phonetic alternation to learn as a newcomer in an area because the monophthization of the I vowel, so this is a big linguistic word, but I is the vowel that we use in words like buy, tie, I, sigh. That actually can occur before a N consonant that's either voiced, meaning there's vocal fold vibration, or it's voiceless. So for example, in a word like white, the T sound doesn't have a lot of vocal fold vibration. In a word like tide, there's a lot of vocal fold vibration. So if you say ta, 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 da, 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 you can put your hand on where your Adam's apple would be if you're female, or your Adam's apple if you're male. And you can say da, ta, and you can actually feel there's a difference in the vibration. Well, the interesting thing about I monophthization is it really only happens before voice consonants. So it tends to happen before a D sound, but not a T sound. So if you say tight, you'll tend to not get it, but tied, you'll tend to get it. So it'd be tied, but tight. This is actually a very complex pattern. And what we find with complex patterns like that is it's really hard for speakers that are adults to pick those up. So when you get a lot of people relocating to an area as adults, their children will be born Southerners, right? But they are not. And picking up maybe Todd as an individual vocabulary item with a monophthized vowel might be easy, but picking up the whole system will not be. So their children will not pick up that complex system. So as you get next generations in the South in these urban areas, what you are doing is basically sort of watering down these differences in a process we call leveling. And that's why if you look on the surface, Northern speech and Southern speech actually seem to be moving closer apart. But the problem is it's actually not in many cases. First of all, urban areas might be, but tons of the South and tons of the North is not urban, it's rural. And if you look at rural speakers, what you find is they actually tend to be more conservative in maintaining dialect differences. We also find that there are other subtle little changes that people do in their vowel system that aren't stereotyped anymore. So pin-pen merger, for example, is a highly stereotypical Southern trait, or something like coffee in the North is a very stereotypical New Yorker trait. These things we know about, but there are a lot of other very subtle ways we can change our vowels that we might not know about. And an example of this in the South would be something like, instead of having the cot merger where C-A-U-G-H-T, the word caught, is no longer highly diphthongal, so it's not caught anymore, it's just caught. So that would be something that you could say, okay, well, that's a change, but that's more conforming to Northern speech. But instead, it's produced at a much higher tongue position in the mouth, so it's more like quat, cut, whereas a Northern will be quat, quat. So you actually hear that there are differences, they're just not the expected differences. So regional variation is actually diverging, not converging. Bryce, you had a question?
So I've heard it said before that like the dialect of England during Shakespeare's time sounded more like Southern English does now.
Right.
And so is that kind of, it's interesting how that reconciles with,
Well,
because now England is very, especially in this, what we think of like a typical English accent, you know, like that, like the London accent. You know, that's
right.
more, that's different than even the Southern accent now, but now London is more populated.
Right.
So,
Well, London is very hip, right? And when you think about what was 17th, 18th century Britain like, London was where it was cool to be, right? It was the hip and happening place and had a huge rise of the merchant class. And it had a lot of socio-political events that made it sort of the new power that people wanted to be like. So the London standard in the 18th century was quite different than the more regionally determined differences that a lot of the colonists brought over in the 16th and early 17th century. So truthfully, I think the thing you said about the South maintaining more of 17th century British English could actually be said of the United States in general. Most of the early dialect settlement in the US occurred prior to the London lect taking over the British dialect, so to speak. So basically a lot of what we have, like the front short vowel a, the way we pronounce it in American English, like glass and cat, is actually an older British pronunciation. And the gloss, caught, kind of pronunciation that we hear that sounds very intellectual and smart today is actually a novel innovation of British English that happened since most of the colonization of the colonies in the US. What would happen with the South is they tended to have a more long-term relationship with Britain than a lot of the other colonies that were early settlements, because they would send their children back to be educated in England. So this preserved some of the later features like R-lessness that came later in British English. So, you know, the pa-kyo-ka kind of speech. Again, in a 17th century Britain, you said your post-vocalic R's, which is what those are called. And it was only an innovation in London that became very popular over time and spread out and became the new norm for Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. In fact, late 18th century. So almost everybody that emigrated to the United States prior to that had an R. And it was only port cities that maintained strong contact with Britain post that period that ended up being R-less, which is why we have pockets of R-less speech in Britain, Charleston, and the Deep South, is because of that longstanding contact. So yes, it's true, we do preserve some relic features, but I would think it's really not true just of the South. But part of the reason people say that is because Appalachian English preserves some relic features like a prefixing and things like that. But there aren't that many Appalachian speakers that you'd want to say it's true of the South generally. Sorry, that was a big diversion, but hopefully an interesting one. But let's get back to dialects though. So regional dialects are very interesting and they're changing. It's all about the vowels is the short answer there. But let's talk about other dialects and what makes people change their speech, because I think these are really more interesting because we don't think about them very often. But of course, age is a vital component of language change. Whenever you think about speakers that are speaking something new and hip, it's rarely the 80-year-olds, right? I mean, I have some cool parents, but they really aren't the people I would think about with innovative variants, right? It's my teenagers, which actually I don't really think about approvingly, their new speech, but they certainly have it. So why is it that young people are so much better at being innovative than old people? Think about that for a minute. What do young people possess that old people don't? Anybody have ideas?
Better brain neuroplasticity.
All right, that's a very good answer. All right, Heather, I need to know what you do because you're having some good answers here. Yes,
I'm just a student at UNR.
Oh, perfect. Okay, Heather. Well, I obviously one of Ian's students because you have it in check there. Yeah, so actually cognitive plasticity is one thing that young people have that we old people don't. When you are young, your brain hasn't lateralized till about age 12 or 13. So you are like a linguistic sponge. You're actually a sponge for everything at that age, but you will soak up language like it's nothing. If you've ever tried to learn a second language as an adult, do you feel like a linguistic sponge? No, not unless you're a wet sponge, because I feel like I get nothing sucked in there, right? But when you hear 5 different languages as a 3-year-old, guess how many languages you will learn? 5 different languages. You won't confuse them. You'll learn them all well. You'll be able to use them in appropriate contexts. I can barely speak English well as an adult, certainly not learn 5 others. So there are a lot of factors. One, cognitive plasticity is one of them, but also motivation. I have other things to do. When I'm 3, I have really nothing. I don't even need a bathroom. I can just use a diaper. I have plenty of time to learn languages. But when I'm 40, I'm really more concerned with putting food on the table and going out to work. So part of it is also my motivation. And it's also probably peer group, right? Because when I'm a kid, what's important to me? Hanging out with other kids, right? When I'm an adult, I'm not that interested in learning from other people. Now, all of you are brilliant because you're here learning something new. But in general, when we go through our daily life, our brain is not wired to just learn things. Our brain is wired to survive. And so when you're in survival mode, and well, maybe we're not hunting for food, we're still more concerned with other things than learning language. So part of the reason young kids are so good at linguistic innovation is because they have the time to be and the brain to be. But it's also because they have the peer group to be. And peer pressure is an enormous one on the formation of linguistic patterns. And I think we underestimate how powerful it is. And everything we're saying today as adult speakers, we're saying because we were in peer groups when we were 10, 11, 12, 13, on upwards to about 17. And once we hit about 18, we have fossilization of our dialect, and our dialects become basically stable. Now, this doesn't mean I can't pick up a few new linguistic tricks, right? I can learn a few terms. I can learn how to twerk with the best of them. But see how that's like 3 years ago, old language. I'm obviously not very good at picking up new tricks, but I can't learn it as perfectly as young kids can. So remember when I was describing the I monophthization in the South and how it's actually quite a complex rule? So it's not even just monophthonize all your I vowels. And by monophthonize means basically shorten the types of vowel differences we put within it. So when you say I, you can see your mouth moves because it has 2 vowel qualities. When you monophthonize, which is another big lovely word to say 5 times fast at a party and be very impressive, you are actually just cutting out that back part. So you just say ah, instead of I, right? So you're just cutting out that last part. But it's not just a matter of doing that. Not only do I have to figure out what I'm doing in terms of what are the vowel qualities I'm changing, I have to figure out, well, do I do it in front of voiced consonants? Do I do it in front of voiceless consonants? How about if there's no consonant? What if it's a stress pattern where I bring in the second consonant to my last consonant? That was very complicated, but what I'm trying to show is that's a complex rule. Well, a kid can move to the South at 5, learn that with no problems. But if I'm an adult, I cannot learn that. Now, I might learn an individual word, so I could say ba, and I might convince you I'm Southern, at least if we had a very short conversation. But I can't learn to do it in the pattern that young kids do it in. So they are very good at being interested in learning new tricks, and they're very good at learning the complexity of new tricks. So for all those reasons, age is pivotal in language variation and change. But age alone doesn't determine things, because if we look at studies of how girls and boys in peer group encounters in high school talk to one another, what we find is there's a fundamental difference between the language of girls and the language of boys. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what that difference might be? Anybody?
Boys have foul mouths.
That's actually very true. They do tend to have foul mouths. Dwayne, were you going to say the same thing?
I do, but I have to give my mother something. I'll be back.
Oh, you go. You can come back and tell me. All right.
I'm going to guess women try to sound more alike and men try to differentiate.
That sound more like. Okay, that is also a very sort of perceptive thing to note, but we'll have to unpack that a little more to understand exactly how that is true. So both Bryce and I'm thinking it's Mark probably that said that, both Bryce and Mark did bring up points that are very true of the differences between men and women, but they're actually a little more complex than the way that we might interpret them on that surface level of, okay, men are always a little more nasty than girls and girls tend to be more similar to each other. It's actually about conforming, right? Who has the pressure to be conformist and who has the pressure to be nonconformist? And what does this actually look like when you unpack how it works with language variation and change? So as Bryce said, boys tend to use more bad words, bad language than girls. And this is definitely true at just sort of a level of vocabulary, but it's also true that they use more non-standard features than girls as a rule. So those are things that you might not notice. This might not be curse words. It might be something like, instead of saying all my consonants in a row in a word like test, I'll delete the last consonant. So instead of saying test, I'll say tests, right? This is a very subtle difference, but it's not standard, right? Because you are deleting a consonant. Or it could be something like palatalization, which is a big word to say don't ya instead of don't you, right? Where you put the ch sound wherever a T or D sound comes with a Y. So that would be something like want you, don't you, did ya, right? All of those things are non-standard, but not highly salient. Or it might be using more in variants instead of ing variants when I say by past participle, like walking, talking, singing. If you combine all these together, even though on an individual level, they're very, very subtle and we might not notice them. When you start using many of those in your speech, it does start to be salient. And it gives off an air of not necessarily nonconformity, but sort of I don't care-ness, or I'm hip and I'm cool and I'm street, right? I'm tough. And that seems to be what's more attractive to boys, right? But then what's more attractive to girls? Because that's also a very important question. And in fact, it seems to be, in terms of the trajectory of language change, that what is more important to girls is more important to language trajectory over time. So it's not what the boys are doing that actually make the difference in language over time. It's actually what the girls are doing. In every single study of language change over time that we have in contemporary dialects, it is almost always the women that are in the lead. And most of these studies take place in early adolescence, and it is always the girls that are in the lead. So these are things that you're probably not even aware of when you're doing them because they're so innovative, but it is what the new norm for the next generation is going to be. So let's give some examples of that. I think Heather had brought up the low back vowel merger that people in the West do. So that's something like words like C-O-T, and I'm going to spell it in case you have the merger or don't. C-O-T, if you say that word, and then C-A-U-G-H-T. Say those to yourself, the two words, C-O-T, C-A-U-G-H-T. Now, for some of you, those are two different words, right? Raise your hand if you're watching and it's two different words. They sound different. For some of you, they'll be merged, all right? So if you live in the North, I can almost put money on it, and you'll owe me after this, $5, I want you to pay up, that they're separate, right? You have cot and quat. Now, I'm not a Northerner, so it's a very bad Northern accent, but that's sort of the sense. If you're from the West, I guarantee you they're the same, right? Heather, are you merged? Yes, Heather is merged there. And that's called the low back vowel merger. So if we do studies of who's doing that more, it is women, right? We also find there's something happening through all dialects of American English called back vowel fronting. And that's where vowels in words like boot or dude or sue or suit, they're actually being pronounced with the tongue much fronter in the mouth than it was 100 years ago. We actually have some archival recordings that we can compare to contemporary speech, and we find that not only do we think that's that they're fronter. We have proof that we are much fronter in our tongue position. So that's a word like do, in a more traditional pronunciation would be do, is now pronounced do. And we think that this has happened over time because historically, and many sound with the oo sound from British English, the y sound, like Tuesday, tune, right? Dew, was brought in to American dialects with that y sound intact. Well, over time, the y sound assimilated to the vowel, which then caused the tongue to front or become higher because a y sound has a high tongue position, and therefore just brought our tongue position fronter. Now, how many of you knew that you had back vowel fronting before this lecture today? See, now you know, hopefully you don't have coronavirus, but you do have back vowel fronting, right? So when we look at patterns of use of back vowel fronting, which is occurring in every American dialect, guess who leads in every single dialect? Young women. Right? So what's happening is young women seem to be on the vanguard of innovative changes. If you look through time, this seems to be true. If we look back at written records to older forms of English, what we find is that shift from the you and ye system, that two polite form system, towards a you only system was led by, guess who? Women. So this seems to be a pattern that has taken place through time. And it seems to be that women are who determine what the next generation will speak. Why would it be that women are so important to the trajectory of change? Does anybody have an idea of why that might be? Anybody? Who raises our kids? For the most part, it's women. Right now, there are certainly changes in this, and now more men are becoming caregivers, but generally speaking, it's women that have been the primary caregivers to children through time. And so who are children learning from? Their mothers. So a more innovative, more advanced system from mothers will be inherited by their children. So if we look at young children who have the system of their parents originally until they go to school and they realize that mom's not all that cool and they'd rather sound like Billy over there with the squirt gun, right? Until that happens around age 4 or 5, young children adopt the system of their parents. So that's their fundamental building block. And anything that happens after that builds on that system. Boys and girls at age 3 or 4 have identical systems, and those systems tend to be closest to their mothers. Now, by the time those same kids reach the age of 18, the girls have progressed almost a full generation ahead of the boys in whatever changes were in their communities. But then those girls have children. Those children then level off. So now the boys and the girls of the next generation are born with this new norm established by the women. And then you have that same pattern that the women advance the changes over their adolescent years, and then they have children, and then the boys come up the next generation. So you find this pattern when you look at linguistic change of boys being about a generation behind that equalizes when they're born to a new mother, right, or to their mother. Does that make sense? All right, I know we're getting close to time and I want to take any questions you have. So why don't I pause here and just answer any random linguistic questions that you might want to ask me.
I had a question.
Okay.
I walked in when you were talking to Bryce about changes in language between the South and the North.
Okay.
And Shakespeare. My understanding is, and maybe I missed something. My understanding is that the English in America originally had the same accent. That the British accent was the Shakespearean accent was closer to Scottish. I've actually put a link in there to YouTube that I heard before,
Right.
and that the English eventually, English eventually got turned over to the received pronunciation, and the Southern English changed after the Civil War. Was there any of that?
Well, there's random facts in there, yes. So it's a little complex. Yes, there are a lot of British dialect settlements along the eastern seaboard that came with the original colonists and with soon to come settlement groups. But there was a ton of Scotch-Irish, predominantly in the South and in Pennsylvania, as well as German and various other groups that we actually had that maybe were less important, but still important. Now the South, again, had a lot more continued contact. So the short answer to your question is Shakespearean English really doesn't factor into American English as much as the dialect patterns of where those immigrants were from in Britain that had very distinct dialectal patterns in the 16th and 17th century that were inherited and became the foundations for the different dialects we have today. So for example, Northern British dialects were quite different than Southern British dialects at that time, more so than now. Now there's still a distinction even there today, but Southern British became the prominent received pronunciation base, whereas Northern British dialects sort of fell out of prestige favor. And so depending on where those dialects were established in the United States by those early settlers, so Northern British or Southern British, that made profound differences in the way that dialects developed subsequently. We also find a lot of Scotch-Irish in the South, which is a lot of times why I think people say it's more close to Shakespearean English. But Scotch-Irish was not all that was established in the South, and there was a lot of continued contact with Southern gentry to British dialects, and a lot of these were Southern British dialects. So there's really a little more dialect mixing than I think that those little tidbits can explain. And I can find and post some really interesting links to that. A good source if you want to read just a quick chapter on early foundational dialects in in American English is from Walt Wolfram and Natalie Schilling, Estes American English. And so I'd be happy to post that afterwards.
Cool, thanks.
No problem. Any other questions?
Well, this is probably completely off the wall, but is there any correlation with religion and languages?
Yes, there is. Certainly a lot of the early dialects, a lot of the British dialects, for example, that were brought over, it was religious persecution, right, that brought them over. And so, you know, think Quakers in Pennsylvania and things like that. And certainly anywhere you get insularity with settlement, you are going to, bring over probably insular dialects because of problems with social blending where you came from. But then you also have more isolation socially here. And so the patterns of what triggers as a linguistic variable that develops over time will become more distinct. So absolutely religious differences are very important. There have been some studies in the West, although not extensive studies, of Mormon dialects that have also found that particularly in Utah, there is a recognizable Mormon dialect. We have looked at some of the Mormon dialects once the Mormons left Utah, and those seem to synthesize more with the local dialects elsewhere. So we haven't found that those traits are particularly resilient to being transferred elsewhere. But as long as those speakers stay in an insular community and talk more to each other than to anybody else, you will get profound dialect differences developing. So absolutely, yes, religion does, we call them religiolects, in fact. Thanks, Neil, that was a good question.
So I have a question, kind of following from this. Like, so if is it because the communities are, if they're smaller, there's the micro variation becomes relatively larger? Is that, you think, a reason why?
Well, yes, that's there. It has to do with vernacular types of relationships in small insular communities. What we find, in fact, is any community, it doesn't have to be a religious one or even a social one, it can be a class-based community. In fact, class is an incredibly powerful determinant of dialect. Whenever we have class groups that tend to be more concentrated, more dense, and more multiplex, what that means is they talk to one another more than they talk to people outside their group, and they talk to each other in more contexts than other people might talk to each other. So I might work with you, and school with you, and hang out with you. So you have these very tight communities. That kind of insularity tends to encourage a vernacular growth. So we have more solidarity-based speech than prestige-based speech. So if there's a global macro level of what's preferred in language, and then this sort of micro level that you're talking about of what means to be local to me, a community that enforces a lot of social solidarity because of being more similar or being segregated for whatever reason will tend to have more micro variation than larger global communities that tend to not talk to each other as often and tend to ascribe to norms that provide higher status kinds of access. So whenever I'm in a community that values standard language and rewards me for using standard language, I'm going to change in that direction. But in most of those insular communities, I don't have that option. So I'm going to get a job, not because I'm sounding highfalutin and adopting standard norms, but because you know me from school and you know my parents and you know I'm a good worker. And what's going to make you convinced of that is that I can use the local dialect in a way that makes you identify with me. There was a really interesting study done by Bill LeBove in Martha's Vineyard. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was done in the 1960s, but it's really an interesting study because it looked at how speakers that were tied really closely to the local land, they were either fishmongers or farmers, and they had several centuries of birthright in Martha's Vineyard, were actually reacting to the encroachment of tourists on Martha's Vineyard by adopting a 17th century relic feature where they would say things like pride or now as proid and neo that identified them as local vineyarders. And it was basically because they were saying, hey, we're an insular community and this marks me as an insider and identifies me as separate from these encroaching tourists that are taking over my community. Now, a recent restudy done in the 2000s of this 1960s study actually found that they no longer really have these very salient features, probably because the encroachment by tourism has been so vast and the loss to the local ecology so great that they couldn't maintain it in the face of these global pressures. So yes, anytime you can maintain insularity, which is harder and harder in this growing global world, the more likely you'll have micro variation.
I have a question about Yiddish. So why is it in some cases, I'm assuming Yiddish came from not written origins, but verbal. So
Right.
why is it in some cases we just get, oh, I adopted a word, but in other cases a full language might come out of a kind of cross-pollination?
You mean in a situation of like language contact?
Yes.
Well, you know, that's sort of on the ethnic language variation level, which is a little different than the ethnic variation derives a little differently than the types that I've been talking about that come to pass from sort of the combination of internal pressures and external social pressures. Whenever we talk about ethnic variation in any way, shape, or form, it's usually contact between two languages, and there's a lot of power and sort of political and economic might that comes to bear on what the outcome of that contact will be. I don't know a lot about Yiddish per se in terms of its development and why we adopt sometimes just certain aspects of it versus the whole language. Probably it has to do with assimilatory tendencies of the people that brought Yiddish. And so if you're more, depending on if you're more outward looking and adopt the language of the group you're going to in terms of an assimilation, you might be more likely to just bring remnants of it than the whole language, or keep them as two completely separate systems and be bilingual. But in other cases, when we look at languages that are either colonized, so that they don't have a lot of choice in the matter, or immigrant languages where the power differential between the dominant language of a community and the language spoken by a sort of less powerful community come in contact, it is almost always the more powerful language that's the killer language in that context. And so what usually survives is the dominant language with substrate influences, meaning very low level, subtle differences that still mark ethnic identity. So for example, African American Vernacular English is a really fascinating case of this because actually it was born from contact between African languages and maritime English that was brought over on slave ships. And so of course it sounds more like English today than African languages, and that's a perfect case of what we call decreolization of a previous Creole. Mark, that was a very complex answer, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, I have one more question. In the tech world, there's a lot of globalization, and
Right.
so very commonly we have, it's often a U.S. company who is hiring people. India, Eastern Europe are the two most predominant, but you get globally in South America, even parts of Africa. And are we seeing, what types of change are we seeing? Because even, let's say India, they speak a British English, or in the UK, or in Eastern Europe, I'm not sure where their kind of English origins come from as they're getting educated, but it's predominantly Americans who are speaking English to them, and presumably from what you're saying, that's the power language because we're the people paying them. And so is that impacting how their English is developing?
Absolutely. So there are actually quite a few linguists that study world Englishes. And world Englishes are interesting because, yes, they're all English, but they're very distinct locally. So there's no such thing as these global languages that are becoming one English. In fact, they're becoming multiple Englishes. And there's a lot of localness that's preserved in those Englishes, because even though they might be talking to Americans or British speakers of English quite often, they're not having the kinds of social interactions that we need, which are basically very close, intimate, one-on-one contact that's socially rewarding, that would make us converge in our dialect features. But it's a powerful language, and so they're going to make sure they're understood by the dominant language speakers. So any changes they have to make in order to make that happen will certainly occur, but we're not going to lose those distinct features of world Englishes, because they also serve an identifying capacity for those speakers as well. But if you look at Americanisms, you can definitely capture the spread in global English. One perfect example that's been widely studied in terms of its spread in global English is the use of the like. That seems to populate young people's speech a lot in American English. What we found is, while that is certainly an American English feature and is used widely by young American females in particular, it's found throughout global Englishes. And we believe that spread is through probably media and contact with American English speakers. So when things are judged to be useful to adopt in making people seem a little more hip or a little more American in their speech style, they may certainly adopt features, but there will never be a point where there's a global English that sounds the same.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you've learned a little something. It's been great talking to you, and I had a lot of fun.